We've been at it for a while, and I have to say, we have hosted many public forums such as this on a variety of environmental topics, and none of those events has ever had a waiting list of 95 people. So clearly this is an issue that is electric and people care about. And so I welcome all of you to come to future events on the equally urgent and important topics that we cover. And you can learn more about our coverage on our website, ecori.org. There's postcards about where you can find that information. So this event sold out in a couple of days, and the waiting list quickly ballooned to about 90 people. And so we are incredibly grateful to our co-host, the Pulitzer Center, for sponsoring the event and especially the live stream, so more people could participate online. Hello, online people. Thank you for joining us. Sorry you couldn't be in the room, but we're here virtually. So this is a really big turnout because I know it's an emotional issue for many people in the room and for those joining online. And it's fair to say that this issue, from what we've seen from our vantage, provoked outrage on both sides of the wind debate and has pitted neighbor against neighbor. But everyone in this room has something in common, believe it or not, and that is our utter dependence on reliable and abundant energy at the flick of a switch. And that energy always has had an invisible downstream effect, whether it's a fracked gas field in Pennsylvania that contaminates a community's water supply, or a West Virginia mountaintop shaved for coal removal, Alberta forest cleared for tar sands, or an oil rig that's polluting fisheries in the Gulf of Mexico. There is a consequence always to powering up, flipping a switch, and plugging in. And to date, much of our energy production and its ill effects have been out of state and out of sight for most Rhode Islanders. And where it does exist, it's typically found in so-called sacrifice zones. Those are low-income communities whose residents don't have the resources to live anywhere else or to fight polluting new fossil fuel infrastructure. Places like Port Providence, I don't know how many of you have been there, but it is truly a sneaky place. Our office is it's right near the port, and days when the wind doesn't blow, we can smell it. So in many ways, offshore wind represents a shift, not just away from fossil fuels, but in the visibility of our energy production. It's really a coastal manifestation of energy infrastructure, and it's visible now to high wealth communities that were previously spared unsightliness of our energy production. So how did we get here? As we seek to stop burning fossil fuels, which are causing global heating and intensifying severe weather events, offshore wind has emerged as one possible solution. And climate scientists agree we have to stop burning fossil fuels if we're to avoid the worst impacts of climate change. Renewable forms of energy, such as wind and solar, are becoming part of the energy mix as states like Rhode Island seek to divest their energy portfolios from fossil fuels. In fact, Rhode Island has set a goal of achieving 100% renewable electricity by 2033. However, renewables are not without their drawbacks, and all energy production has an environmental impact. At EcoRI News, we have a policy. We don't call any energy clean energy. There is no clean energy. It's renewable energy. And finally, if I may insert my opinion briefly, I'd like to note, as we argue the benefits and shortcomings of wind, one thing we really aren't talking about is personal sacrifice. That's using less. It's something everyone in this room may already be doing or could do if they're not already. Use less energy, consume less stuff, live in smaller homes. This could have an upside for climate and nature. For too long, vulnerable people and nature have paid dearly for overconsumption habits. And maybe it's time to think a little bit more about how to live more lightly on the one earth we share. So, our goal here today is to try to set the record straight on offshore wind by turning to our panel of experts who have generously taken the time to share their knowledge about the role of offshore wind and how it will meet the state's energy goals and what its societal and environmental impacts are. Again, I know this is an emotional topic, and I would just appeal to everyone in this room to show respect to each other and to our panelists. And I would be remiss in my official duty as publisher and executive of this nonprofit organization if I didn't stress that we are a nonprofit and we do rely on support of people like you to donate to keep these events free for all if you can. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce our moderator this evening, Mike Stanton. He's a professor of journalism at the University of Connecticut, pulitzer-prize winning journalist, author, EcoRI News board president. Take it away, Mike. Thank you, everyone, for coming.
Thank you, Joe. And thank you for being here. So we're going to dive right in. I'll start by just briefly introducing our panelists. Closest to me, we have Frank Carini, our co-founder, senior reporter, and columnist. We have Bob Kenny, University of Rhode Island, marine mammal scientist. We have Chris Kearns, the acting commissioner of the Rhode Island Office of Energy Resources. We have Trish Yadley, the Atlantic Coast Offshore Wind Policy Manager at the Nature Conservancy. We have Michael Lombardi, a diving scientist and the founder of Ocean Opportunity, Inc. And last but not least, we have Rich Hittinger, chairman of the Rhode Island Saltwater Anglers Association, Legislative and Artificial Reefs Committees. So welcome, thank you, all of you. Frank, I'm going to get started with you. You wrote a column last week saying that you're against the status quo in terms of our destructive energy consumption, but you could take it or leave it regarding offshore wind. If we all agree that our current path is unsustainable and that we need to wean ourselves off fossil fuels, is offshore wind inevitable here in southern New England, given our habits?
Yeah, it's working. I have a big knowledge.
Yeah, take that.
Yeah, I think it's if we're not going, Joanne already said it in her opening remarks, but if we're not going to, in any collective way, Rhode Island and elsewhere, if we're going to keep consuming mass amounts of energy and resources, then I think offshore wind and more fossil fuels are inevitable. And if we don't want offshore wind, or we don't want, power plant in Burville, which took a couple of years to fight and make, we have to ramp down our consumption of energy and materials. They're all finite. And the planet has all these resources that are finite. We act as if it's a buffet. I mean, the collectively. So yes, I think it's inevitable if we don't change our habits. And I think I'll say it's only fair because a lot of the polluting infrastructure is in Cancer Alley in Louisiana, Gary, Indiana, or Allen's Avenue here. But then there's also this pollution that comes with offshore wind or turbines in general, or solar, because there's rare earth components that have to be mined, and that's in Brazil and other places. So there's pollution all around, no matter what the energy source is. And I think we have to be, first and foremost, we have to use less. If we're not going to do that, then I think we're going to be stuck with a lot of energy options we don't like.
I'm just going to write down the table just to be democratic. Can you maybe check that microphone number 2, see if it's working? You can sing a song or something.
Test, is this on? Can you all hear me? Yeah.
Okay, good. All right. So Bob, I want to ask you as a longtime marine mammal scientist, what have you seen in the oceans around here in terms of the changes wrought by climate change? And what are your thoughts about the pros and cons of offshore wind development here?
We have seen many changes in the distribution of marine mammals in response to climate change. Up until 2010, I would have sat here and said, we maybe see right whales passing through in April on their way from Florida to Cape Cod Bay. And if there's food out there, they might hang around for a week or 2 weeks. Now they're out there for months at a time because they're the distribution of their food has completely changed around because of warmer water. Pros and cons of offshore, we just asking for my opinion, in my opinion, no, I'm no more value there than anyone else.
Okay,
I'm in favor, but
yeah,
be that as it may.
okay, well, we'll get into the details on this. But Commissioner Kearns, I'd like to ask you, Rhode Island has set a goal. We're the first state in the country to have an offshore wind farm. And we're kind of on the cutting edge of this. One of the reasons I think there's so much interest in this issue. Can you talk about what Rhode Island's energy goals are as far as carbon neutral and where wind fits in? In other words, how do we get our electricity now? And if you talk about what your goals are in terms of offshore wind and then how that would change the mix.
All right, if I just bring this.
Sure.
Perfect. So first, thank you for having us here tonight. It's always good to be here. Really like this building. Was here a couple of months ago for another engagement on energy storage related topics. So it's always good to be here. Ultimately, the state has 100% renewable energy standard goal, an objective of 100% renewable energy in terms of our electricity generation by the end of 2033. A number of states across the country have different either renewable energy standard or renewable portfolio standards, striving for 100% renewables be in the 2030s into the 2040s time frame. Certainly offshore wind is a component of the state's renewable energy standard in terms of the eligible technologies, which include offshore wind, land-based wind, rooftop solar, ground-mounted solar, biomass related product, and small-scale hydropower. So we have a blend of renewable energy resources that the state strives to meet each year in terms of our obligation. We've had the renewable energy standard in place since it went into effect in 2007, and the law has evolved over the last several years. Certainly the Black Island Wind Farm, in terms of that 30 megawatts of capacity, went into operation in November of 2016. And that plays a role in terms of the state's renewable energy objectives, similar to the Revolution Wind Project. And then more recently, the new project, the South Coast Wind related project.
Okay. Thank you. Trish, in your capacity, you've been involved with the deployment of offshore wind, working with various agencies, and previously you were a legal counsel to the Commercial Fisheries Center of Rhode Island, involved in regulation and negotiations, I should say, to compensate commercial fishermen for losses. And when you look at all the different angles of offshore wind and the climate, literally, that we live in, I guess the overriding question, can we strike a balance to responsibly develop offshore wind farms that respects everyone's concerns and addresses the climate concerns?
Sure. Well, hi, everyone. It's nice to be here. And, glad to have the invitation. So we have to strike a balance because I'm kind of like a statistics queen, so I'm gonna throw out numbers, and I look a lot at numbers and a lot of data and science, but these reducing greenhouse gas emissions by 80% by 2050 are goals that the states are aligned to achieve because they track back to these global climate goals that are set by international science, right? That we have to limit global temperature increases to no more than 1.5 degrees Celsius, or that results in significant habitat and species changes. So all of the goals that we see from states along the Atlantic coast are really in line to get our economies decarbonized by that 80% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions by 2050. I just want to push back a little bit on Frank's position that it's not just energy efficiency. We've seen a number of decarbonization studies that tell us that we have to decarbonize the electricity sector. We have to we have to do energy efficiency, and we also have to electrify transportation and building. So that will result in an increased electricity demand, nearly doubling of our electricity demand. And we don't have the resources to meet those increased energy demands. Right now, I was just looking at this, I don't know if you all have, you can download it. It's an ISO New England resource map. It tells you what the resource mix is right now at any given moment in ISO New England. Right now, our system demand is 13 gigawatts of energy, and 66% of that is being met by natural gas. 9% is being met by renewables, but it'll tell you what the mix is, and you can look at that in real time. So I do think that we have this challenge of having to deploy not just offshore wind, but also solar, but also battery storage, doing energy efficiency at a pace and scale that allows us to meet these targets. And that means that we may not always have the data and the information that we want as we build out these projects. And we have to kind of position ourselves to get the input from the communities that are going to be impacted and to get the best available data as early on in the process as possible, so that when we pick locations for offshore wind, we're doing that in a way that's informed by the best science and the best community input.
Thank you. Mike, you're a professional diver. You see the water from a different perspective than a lot of us do. You've also worked with scientists, as I understand, marine biologists out in the ocean here. You recently wrote a column for EcoRI News, in which you said Rhode Island has become ground zero for the most important environmental battle in modern times. So what's your perspective on the peril and promise of offshore wind, from your experience?
First, thanks for having us. So I guess before I offer any comments, I just want to emphasize I have absolutely zero conflicted interests, zero relationships with any party at all other than myself. I'm here purely out of very genuine, deep personal concern for the ocean environment, which I've spent far more time than most people could ever imagine. I've literally had periods of time where I've spent more of my awake day underwater than not. Most of that for over 20 years was in support of inshore marine construction throughout Rhode Island. So I have a very personal understanding of how marine construction works, why we do marine construction, why we're allowed to do permanent marine construction where we do, and where it's very detrimental to the environment, short and long term. At the same time, I've worked with scientists. I have a degree in marine science. I've maintained a number of professional affiliations in the science community and collaborations. And what wind has brought to the community is really heartbreaking. I've never in 30 years experienced walking into a group of peers and having people have such disagreement to the point where friendships are lost. Professional associations are lost. It's completely upended the way our marine community, which is typically very clean, operates. It's just heartbreaking. So that aside, from a practical standpoint, my honest opinion is that yes, we need a diverse energy portfolio moving forward. Yes, fossil fuels are bad. But the solution to that is, to find a solution to anything, you have to look to the root of the problem. The root of the problem, Frank's point and Joe's point, is consumption, 100%. We live on a planet of 8+ billion people. There are plenty of studies that showed our carrying capacity as a planet is maybe around 10 billion people. And then what happens, right? So it's not even so much that we can't, or that there's a challenge in flipping the lights on. How do we make enough energy at the rate we consume now? How do we do that at 10 billion people and 12 billion people? But our planet is obviously not happy. And, you know, to Bob's point, we have had changes in the environment that are our own fault. So what do we do? In my opinion, I think offshore wind has the inherent risks of the environment outweigh the immediately tangible benefits. And going further, I honestly think it's a discussion that shouldn't even be had, particularly Rhode Island, because I think it violates our coastal development laws right from the get-go. I think offshore wind in an otherwise pristine environment is misplaced in many respects.
Thank you. Rich, you're involved with the Saltwater Anglers Association, member of the Rhode Island Fishermen's Advisory Board. Fishermen are obviously one of the more visible groups that have been affected and have been involved with, taking positions on offshore wind. Obviously, fishermen have also been harmed by forces before offshore wind in terms of climate change, in terms of overfishing. So what's the fishing industry's perspective on this? Is there a way to coexist with offshore wind? And if so, what needs to be done to make that happen?
Well, thank you very much for the invitation for being here. And I just want to give a little bit of background. I've been involved in this question for over 14 years, actually about 15 years now, because I helped the CRMC write the chapter in the Ocean SAMP on fisheries. And all along, my organization, Rhode Island Saltwater Anglers Association, have been reaching out to various parties saying, hey, look, talk to us. We have questions. We need answers. We've got alternatives we want you to look at. And for the most part, we've been ignored. And so that, I think, is an indication of what we see is wrong with the whole process. The problem is that someone has made a decision that these facilities will be constructed no matter what the cost, and they will be constructed at a rate which suits the developers. So as soon as the developers are ready to go, they have to have the permits in place and they have to move forward. Now, we have been identifying alternatives. I was part of the Fisheries Advisory Board for many years, representing recreational fishing. And we asked for evaluation of reasonable alternatives, and most of those requests were ignored by both CRMC and by the developers, and by BOEM, of course. So we see this as a process that possibly could have gone well. I look back at the Block Island Wind Farm. That was a difficult process, but I think it went reasonably well. We would say that we accept the fact that that facility was constructed and it was placed in our environment and it had impacts on us, but it was a necessary step in evaluating offshore wind. When it came to constructing facilities on Cox Ledge, which is an area of critical habitat, we felt we were tremendously impacted and we were not given the time of day by CRMC or by the developers. So we feel that the way the process is moving, there is no way for us to coexist with offshore wind.
All right, we can tell which way the wind is blowing on that question in this crowd. But Bob, I want to come to you. Cox's Ledge is a place that's mentioned a lot. Can you tell us about that area and how it's being handled in terms of offshore wind development and the potential impacts there?
From the perspective of marine mammals, Cox's Ledge is not that much more important than any other place. So that's where I have to look at this. I'm not fisheries expert.
Okay.
I'm not a fish biologist, so. In terms of the marine mammals, they were also factored in during the ocean set. I wrote that chapter. And things that were critical habitat for marine mammals at the time that was done were excluded.
Okay. Thank you. Frank, so what we're hearing from different panelists is that we're either moving too fast or too slow when it comes to offshore wind. What's your sense following this debate as a journalist on the pace?
I think when it comes to offshore wind, this doesn't make it right or wrong. But when it comes to offshore wind, I think it's more scrutinized than land-based wind or land-based solar. You know, we've been cutting down, ask Chris, I've reached out to him a bunch of times, pitching, complaining, not that it's his fault. But, you know, cutting down all these forests and putting solar panels doesn't make sense. But I, in terms of offshore wind, I think it's more scrutinized than that. Does that mean scrutinized enough? I don't know, but it's certainly more scrutinized than our land-based renewable energy.
Okay. Chris, one of the issues, and this is a very complicated issue, is the price of offshore wind, but there's a lot of factors that go into that. Rhode Island recently joined Massachusetts there was a tri-state auction that both states participated in. Connecticut, at least to this point, declined. Can you talk about that process and what it means for the future development of offshore wind?
Yeah, so in terms of the most recent procurement, so this was a process that began back in 2023 between the three states in terms of something of multi-state regional procurement coordination, where they got to explore opportunities. So Rhode Island put out a procurement earlier this year, looking at potentially up to 1,200 megawatts of additional capacity.
Could you just kind of explain for someone like trying to get my brain around it? What does it mean you're putting out a procurement and, you know, the advantage of doing it?
Yeah, so historically, the states have, when they look at energy procurements, they go individually out in terms of working with their respective utility or utilities within their respective state. Within Rhode Island, it's predominantly the load share is managed by Rhode Island Energy, that was previously National Grid, whereas Mass and Connecticut, you know, have multiple utilities within their jurisdiction. So historically, the states have looked at offshore wind individually with their procurements. This was the first time where we decided to team up to see what would bring a collaborative effort through that process. We still all issued our own respective procurements, but per our state laws and how we have to follow things. But we also want to evaluate in terms of if we can partner together on these projects, if warranted. So we issued a procurement or an RFP for up to 1,200 megawatts of offshore wind capacity, and then through the process, the evaluation by the three states and the utilities, Rhode Island made the determination of selecting 200 megawatts of a 1,200 megawatt project. Massachusetts would acquire the remaining 1,000 megawatts of that capacity. And ultimately, that process is playing out right now in terms of negotiations, the contractual terms and conditions between the utility and the developer. The time frame for that will be the public filing will be made sometime in, I think, early to mid-December of this year. There'll be a docket established before the Public Utilities Commission. And then there'll be an evidentiary record hearing proceedings, all public, also virtually online. That will likely take place, I would venture to guess, sometime between January into the spring, early summer of next year.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you. Trish, can you talk about the pricing? You know, we live at the end of the pipeline for natural gas, which supplies most of our electricity now, correct, in New England. And can you talk about the pricing of offshore wind and what that is going to look like going forward and how that compares to fossil fuel? Because you hear we're already paying high electric rates, and then you hear about the cost factors, but it's complicated.
Yeah, that's a very complicated question. Thanks, Mike.
Sorry.
All right, well, let's try to break it down a little bit. So there are different ways to look at the cost of offshore wind. One is the way that Chris is just talking about it. It's a snapshot essentially in time. You're looking at the price per kilowatt hour, the price per megawatt hour in a 30-year contract. But that's not the only way to look at the cost of offshore wind. You can also look at the cost of offshore wind and other energy technologies relative to each other. So I just mentioned how at this particular moment, our resource mix in the grid is using 66% natural gas. Natural gas is not something that we have natively in New England. So that has to come through the pipelines. The supply has to be gotten, and there's a spot market price for natural gas. And that spot market price is determined by the highest cost electricity generator in natural gas in the system at that moment in time. So it's a very volatile, kind of vulnerable mechanism for setting the price. We don't get like a locked in price. We get whatever that price is at the moment the highest priced generator is set up in the market. So that's one way to think about it. Then there's the other things which I look at and was, really greatly affected as a prosecutor for the state. I did a lot of Clean Air Act prosecution, a lot of Clean Water Act prosecution. I was the lead prosecutor on the Brayton Point facility. That facility withdrew 1 billion gallons of water a day and discharged 1.5 billion gallons of heated water into Mount Hope Bay. That is the same is true for nuclear plants and all fossil fuel fired plants that need cooling water. So their intake of all that water has a cost. Same is true with the air emissions. Okay, there are, since like the 1950s when these plants were first built, there was this idea that they would be phased out, that we wouldn't need to modify them, that they would be replaced by some better technology. But the companies that own these power plants didn't phase them out. They just modified them. They kept them going for generations after, decades after. And they fought tooth and nail to apply the best control technologies at those facilities. They fought for decades. I had 3 babies while I was litigating the Brayton Point case. I mean, I'm talking like the amount of money put into avoiding pollution control technology was staggering. And people were getting sick. They're being like killed near these power plants. And in the Port of Providence, we have the 4th highest asthma rate in the country in the Port of Providence, and the highest child asthma rate. That's the direct result. There are costs associated with using these types of energies. There are costs. So you can't just look at the cost of this offshore wind contract. You have to look at the landscape. That's my opinion. You can look at it however you want, but I think you have to look at the landscape and say that the reason that nuclear at Millstone is 5 cents a kilowatt hour is because there are a lot of avoided costs. Decades of avoided costs. But you lost fish. You can speak to what happened to winter flounder in Mount Hope Bay as a result of Brayton Point. 87% decline. The winter flounder population collapsed. So I don't know, are there costs? Do we not consider those costs because they're not part of our ratepayer bill or our utility bill? We are paying for that as a society. Somebody's paying those costs. So that's how I think about the cost of renewable energy. And I know I go on a rant, I'm very passionate about it because I've seen people really being taken advantage of by energy for a long time. And I think we should all be kind of curious about it.
Thank you. Mike, what's your take on those kinds of costs and how you balance that against the costs that you say offshore wind will incur?
Well, there's concessions every, there's costs and concessions everywhere, right? Energy isn't free.
Hold the mic close, please.
So, you know, energy isn't free, it'll never be free. What costs, and has always costed, is conservation, right? You have to spend money to clean things. You have to spend money to protect the air. You have to spend money to recycle. When I was growing up, I remember vividly in elementary school, it was, you know, reduce, reuse, recycle. Like they hammered that into us. And at the same time, you know, this is, we'll get to this, I'm sure, but it was save the whales. Reduce, reuse, recycle, and save the whales. Those are the two messages I took home from elementary school, right? And both of those cost a ton out of pocket, and the consequences of not doing them also cost us, to your point. So, you know, when I look at what goes on offshore and developing any natural environment, I take a precautionary approach. I don't think we should be out there at all. From a physical environment standpoint, the very act of driving piles into glacial moraine damages the bottom. Most people don't. Some people here don't even know what glacial moraine means. It's basically, you know, we have a rocky bottom area of the ocean that happens to be, because it's rocky and there's structure to it, marine life likes that. Marine life likes structure, right? That's some of the science that guides this stuff. So when you introduce construction, you disrupt the natural habitat. You can't avoid that disruption. That will happen. It carries consequences, of course. There's short-term consequences that are easy to recognize, but then there's long-term consequences that are very, very difficult to recognize. At the same time, to the point of cooling water, we have substations offshore that are pulling through seawater to cool the system. Millions and millions and millions of gallons, right? And they were treated chemically so that there isn't marine growth in these structures, which will clog the system and cause other problems, so it reduces maintenance. So now we're offshore in a pristine environment. Now, mind you, most of us, you know, we live within, you know, arm's reach of the coast. We enjoy it, it's beautiful, we interact with it to the extent we can, go on the beach and whatnot. Very, very few people have been offshore. The appeal to going offshore, whether it's for sport or professionally as a fisherman or you know, for other recreational purposes, is you're in the wild, right? It's this, when you watch TV and says, oh, this is the last frontier, we have to preserve the last frontier. It's the lifeblood of the planet. It's not just gobbledygook on the Discovery Channel, right? It's true. The ocean is the lifeblood of our planet. And if we're going to impact it without understanding long-term impacts, we're going to have major, major problems. And in hindsight, like what we've had with other development, like the breaking points of the world and other places, hindsight's always 20/20, right? We should learn that lesson and know that jumping into massive scale development in pristine environments could be a massive, massive, massive problem. Now, Rich could probably speak to what some of those long-term issues are because they're very much fisheries related. But you know, we hear, oh, well, the structures themselves, fish-like structure creates an artificial reef. Sure it does. But if you're a cod fisherman, do you want a new place for all the blackfish to populate? You know, there are federal laws that speak to how artificial reefs should be created, where they're created, why they're created, how they'll impact the local environment. None of that's being considered. It's just, it'll create a reef that looks good, and you know, Boone can post a little snippet on Twitter. Oh, we've got a blackfish on the piling. It looks like we did some good. No, that's not how it is. So, and you got to understand scale. This isn't, you know, Block Island. We've got 10 turbines out there. Five turbines out there. One project that really perked me up to all this, Revolution Wind, is lots and lots of turbines. I don't know what the final count is. It's in the 60s or
65, I think.
65. It's irrelevant. It covers 100,000 square acres. Huge. I mean, you can't even if you've never been offshore, it should be a fundamental requirement for anybody involved in policy related to offshore wind or regulating anything that has to do with any impacts related to that activity, to spend time offshore in that environment. Not just, get out there, stick your head in the water, but throw everything at it so you understand exactly what you signed up for. Because you have no idea. Okay.
Right. A term that gets used a lot is by critics is that they are industrializing the ocean. And can you talk about the ocean and what's a way to frame what's happening out there?
Mike's right, off our coast, there isn't any of that, but we all share the energy, right? So BOEM actually manages 2,300 oil and gas rigs with 55,000 wells covering 12.1 million miles on the continental shelf, and that's just in the United States waters. So we're already industrialized. I'm not saying we should industrialize more. I get what Mike's saying. I'm just saying it's already industrialized. Maybe not off our coast, but the energy we're getting, it's industrialized from somewhere. So in the Gulf of Mexico, there's like 600 oil and gas rigs, if not more. And then there was one, the longest oil spill. It took 20 years. There was an oil spill for 20 years in the Gulf of Mexico on a well that had been abandoned. And it took them 20 years to fix it, and millions of gallons of oil. See that for 20 years. So I mean, we've already, again, I'm not saying we should do more, and I'm not saying we should put oil and gas rigs off the coast of Rhode Island, but we're already industrializing the ocean. So is it okay for us to pollute the ones in the Gulf of Mexico, or?
That doesn't make it right, period.
Water wells.
I didn't say it didn't make it right.
That's what you're arguing.
No, I'm not.
But is it
Is it okay,
industrializing?
so it's okay down there, as long as we get the energy up here?
No.
That's all I'm saying, we've already industrialized the oceans, maybe not off our coast.
But not up here.
Well, we all want energy, right?
And we don't have to industrialize the ocean here to get it.
I guess the question is,
All right, how do we get it?
Nuclear?
You want to build a nuclear power plant in Good Mountain?
Not one of you mentioned nuclear.
What?
Not one of you mentioned nuclear. All of our emissions and carbon, not one of you mentioned nuclear. It's an alternative. Since staring us in the face.
I actually did, I talked about the Millstone plant. Millstone, what I wanted you to understand is that there are significant water requirements for nuclear
Or
facilities.
they will not.
Where they build cooling towers, but cooling towers, I was the lead attorney for the state of Rhode Island in multiple states in a case that went to the US Supreme Court on that topic, where Justice Scalia said that the EPA could not require cooling towers. So it is not something that the Clean Water
That's
Act
because of the,
requires of nuclear facilities.
We have a nuclear reactor in the state.
so Bob,
Just talk-
I'm gonna shift it to you.
It's time.
You have 50 in the 50 miles from here.
I'm gonna talk, Bob,
He said you are right.
what's your take as a marine mammal scientist who studied, out in the ocean, this term that the ocean is being industrialized?
The ocean has been industrialized since humans first put boats in the water. The days that I was at a place like Brenton Point or Beaver Tail or Northern Bird Sanctuary and noticed that there was a wind farm, a wind turbine that I could actually see being constructed, that wasn't the most obvious thing that I could see. It was some giant ship carrying a load of cars heading for Quonset Point. We want to import cheap stuff from all around the world that comes on big ships that kill, that pollute.
Let's talk about whales. That's a flashpoint.
So let's take a vote here. I want a show of hands. How many people in this room think that the federal government has issued permits to wind farm developers to kill marine mammals?
Okay, it's a show of hands, not voices.
You love
Show of hands, not voices.
I don't want to use the word take. You guys always put take in quotation marks to mislead everyone to think that it means kill.
Does.
You-
What does it mean, Bob?
It means kill, bother, annoy, injure. The permits that are being given, the number of mortalities that have been permitted is 0. I can read you a quote from a Green Oceans white paper. In big letters, I can almost read it without my glasses. Or maybe I can't.
Well, paraphrase, you were familiar with.
So it said that the total number of takes permitted now, and it gave a number that was almost 600,000. The government has permitted the developers to harass, to disturb, injure, and kill 600,000 marine mammals. The total number, if you broke down the number that they gave, it was 99.75% disturb, 1/4% minor injuries like temporary threshold shifts, temporary deafness, and 0 mortalities. There have been 0 permits to kill away. None.
It doesn't mean none of it killed, none of that was sold.
None. It does. Show me the evidence that wind farms have killed a whale.
Okay, let's get the microphone to Rich.
But you were on a topic as you were coming down this way, and I had some things that I would like to say about that topic. And basically, that topic is why offshore wind? And I agree with some of the things that were said, that we need an overall approach to our energy management and our energy production. We need to consider reducing the CO2 emissions through of what we're doing. But we are not looking at it holistically. What we need to do is, if you, I was involved in air permitting for my career. Okay, so I looked at the air emissions for various industrial facilities, and I looked at the CO2 emissions for one coal burning power plant in North Carolina. And I can tell you the name of the power plant, but I just looked at this recently. If you switch that one power plant from coal to natural gas, you will reduce the overall emissions dramatically, and you will reduce the CO2 emissions by over 5 million tons per year. The entire Revolution Wind project reduces the CO2 emissions by 463,000 tons per year. So by switching one power plant in North Carolina, you get more than 10 times the reduction of CO2 as you do from the entire Revolution Wind project. Now, as Rhode Island, we can't claim that that's a reduction in CO2 for us, but it is a reduction in CO2, and CO2 is a worldwide issue. As we buy more and more things from China, including wind turbines and everything required to construct wind turbines, we're encouraging coal-fired power plants to be built in China and India and other places, because they're being built there very quickly. Now, the other thing that I wanted to point out is we're talking about needing to put offshore wind in off of Rhode Island. I think the reason why you're seeing such a reaction to it is that you're looking at an industrialization, you're looking at a placement of very complicated machinery, very loud machinery, very large machinery in an environment where we haven't had it before. So if you were to take a coal plant and convert it to a natural gas plant, you're not changing the environment. You're not entering a new area. Cox Ledge never had anything like this. Now we have turbines on top of Cox Ledge. We've got foundations all around Cox Ledge. We're going to have turbines all around Cox Ledge within the next year. And the problem is that you are pushing this on an area that's never seen it before. Thank you.
Chris, good morning. There's a lot of debate about energy mix and obviously reducing emissions. What's this, your perspective on this in terms of, you know, the need to have wind and the need to lessen other sources of power?
Yeah, so I mean, certainly there's passion on both sides of this issue. And we've seen it in terms of whether it's offshore wind, or when it was the proposed gas plant up in the Burrillville, northern Rhode Island, that triggered a lot of passion by constituents up in that area concerned about a new gas plant being built, to even, as Frank looked to some of the solar related activity in terms of ground mountain solar projects and the concerns that constituents had in terms of South County and Kent County in terms of impacting in terms of wildlife. So energy projects do have an impact. Ultimately, you're replacing something with something else. All these things are going to have some degree of impact. Ultimately, when we look at renewables from the state side, we're looking at in terms of broad renewables. So again, it does include offshore wind. Offshore wind is something the state has been looking at since 2007. So we're approaching almost 20 years since we began the ocean sand process. I remember I was wrapping up my time at the University of Rhode Island as a student. So this has been, something that's been a part of the conversation in terms of offshore wind, approaching 20 years with these projects. Solar has had its issues over the last several years. Again, we just had a lengthy debate on the proposal for the new natural gas plant proposal. Nuclear is certainly a very interesting topic, not so much for the nuclear of the systems that were built in the 60s, the 70s, and the 80s, but we're certainly seeing in terms of AI and the data centers, in terms of microgrid nuclear opportunities. So it's constantly evolving, but I've just gotten used in terms of being in this world that pretty much every form of energy is going to trigger some type of a reaction, good and bad, depending on the technology.
Okay, thank you. So we kind of touched on it with the whales a little bit, but there's been a lot of criticism on both sides of disinformation. So, I think especially the fact is these are new to our waters, offshore wind farms. So how much do we really know about the potential harm? And how much are we being told it's just flat out wrong? I think I was gonna throw it to Frank. He's been. Bob, go ahead.
Depends on what the species that we're talking about is. Some we know a lot and some we don't. For North Atlantic right-whales, because they are, we used to be able to say they were the most endangered whale in the world, but now we have to say they're now the second most endangered whale in the world. There is dedicated funding for necropsies. We have never had a right whale wash up on the beach of the United States during all the years that this unusual mortality event has gone on, where the necropsy failed to show a cause of death. And the cause of death, except for 2 cases of stillborns, is always number 1, getting killed in fishing gear, number 2, getting run over by a ship. We have 0 evidence for any effect of wind farms on right whales. So we have 0 evidence for effective wind farms on other species, but for other species, that's much more likely that a necropsy is going to be inconclusive. When you have a dead whale on the beach and you can't tell what caused its death, the answer is not, well, it must have been the wind farm because there was this ship out there during surveys and it must have killed the whale. We just can't tell it. Has just as much sense behind it as saying, oh, it was a death ray from a UFO that killed it. Because we have the same amount of evidence for both.
Okay. What about, are there any studies in, of the wind farms in Europe? Now, I know the right whales probably aren't over there, but just in terms of.
They've been studying the dickens out of those since they put them in.
Mhm.
They have shown that during the pile driving for some of the closer to shore wind farms, the seals all left. And when the pile driving was over and just the wind farm was in operation, the seals all came back. They haven't been able to show any harmful effects on the seals. I was trying to see if there were papers published, was there any effect on fishery landings, but the landings there are so variable that I don't think they could tease that out.
How about wells?
They don't have whales there. There are no whales there.
There are wells.
There are whales in Europe, but not in the North Sea. Where the wind farms are, whales don't occur. They're out in the Bay of Biscay and out to the west of the British Isles.
Well, they started to-
Okay, Mike, you were itching to say something.
Well, I'd like to put some,
Microphone.
sorry. I'd like to, just so to have context to the whale discussion. Every project, through its review process, ends up issued an incidental take authorization. Now, the way this comes about is follow that be at NOAA, look at the environmental impact statement, they look back at our sample. I read your contribution, fantastic, critical information. And then they say, okay, based on everything you know and the construction plan and what we expect to happen out there, we're gonna put some numbers on this to say, based on the nature of the activity, animals will be harassed. And you use the word harassment, right? So there's a level A harassment. There's a level B harassment. Now, level A harassment, and this is what the regulation, this is verbatim. This involves acts that have the potential to injure a marine mammal or marine mammal stock in the water. Examples include pursuit, torment, or annoyance that could lead to physical harm. Now, to Bob's point, there's no permit to kill. We would never do that. That's legalized waiting. Don't do that. That's level A harassment. So there's the potential for physical harm. Level B harassment is a lesser offense, right? So this refers to acts that have the potential to disturb a marine mammal by causing disruption of behavioral patterns. This could include changes to migration, breathing, nursing, breeding, feeding, or sheltering behaviors, but does not result in physical injury. So that harassment means that the act of harassing will not cause physical injury. It doesn't mean that the act of harassment will not cause a behavioral pattern that will then result in an injury or death. Doesn't mean that at all. You could absolutely have, an animal that's been thrown off course or is deaf or is, otherwise impacted, and then they get hit by a ship because they're not in a perfect state. That can absolutely happen. Is the data to show that? No, it's how would you gather the data? We don't have people out there watching every single whale and say, oh, Frank just got harassed and then Frank just washed up on the beach. We don't have that level of observation. Right.
Right, Trish, would you like to respond?
No.
Okay, Mike, let's move on.
There's no, most critical part of this is revolution win, right, which is the contentious one here. Put some numbers to this. Level A harassment, start easy.
Mike, I'm gonna cut you off. We get the idea now.
I'm gonna follow Paul's answer. Based on Bob's science, the federal government said that we're gonna issue level B harassments for one project, 19,229 marine mammals.
Okay, thank you. Bob, can you clarify this? Put some perspective on this?
284 animals.
Mike,
We can,
it's a panel.
we can speculate all we want about what happens to the whale after it's disturbed and it moves away from the noise. Because the permit is issued, doesn't mean those things happen.
Oh.
So, no. Here's, let me read this to you. This is for Vineyard Wind, phase one. They were issued 115 level A takes. The number of level A takes that were actually taken, 0.
Okay, can you clarify? How do we know that?
Because every time that
Let him answer.
they were issued level A takes during pile driving. That's the only thing that's loud enough to cause that sort of temporary hearing loss.
No, it's solar does.
The sonar is not loud enough. The pile driving is much louder than the sonar.
According to the natives, according to the sheep.
What?
Trish, let's Trish go ahead here.
Questions about disinformation.
Mm-hmm.
There's disinformation and there's misinformation, and misinformation, I think, is, a genuine, we just have the wrong information, and disinformation is kind of taking information and using it incorrectly. And I think it's really interesting, and we have someone here who is an esteemed marine mammal expert, is a PhD. And no one on this panel would question Mike's expertise or Rich's expertise and say that you don't know what you're doing about diving. But when he talks about what he knows about whales, he's criticized by people who do not have PhDs in that field. I just think that's it's an observation I'm making, and I think it's interesting. Well, it's just that.
Excuse me, sir, we're gonna get to the written questions. You can converse with her afterwards.
But I wanted to address this man has asked this question in the white hat a few times, and I wanted to, and I don't know your name, but you've asked this a few times. There's a lot of study that's underway. You can look at the Duke Offshore Wind and Wildlife, forget what the official name is. It's called
Project
WOW.
WOW.
Project WOW, I'm saying it wrong, but wind,
Medicine wind farms.
yeah, something like
Medicine
that.
wind.
But we also did a webinar at TNC on whales, where we brought in the head at Duke University who's leading some of this research, and you can watch that. There's links on YouTube. But there's a lot of people doing a lot of study about all these different really complicated aspects of so consider this, I know this now because I'm getting older, right? There's decibel and there's frequency. There's certain things that I just can't hear anymore because they're too low. They can be really loud, right? But I can't hear them. And so the people that study whales understand that there's different decibels and frequencies, and they're trying to figure out how far sound extends and at what point that impacts whales or may cause behaviors where whales are discouraged from feeding, or they move, or they put themselves at risk, like moving into shipping lanes and that kind of thing. The important thing to remember about incidental take and incidental harassment is that those are set up by Congress, right? It's part of our Endangered Species and Marine Mammal Protection Act that was established by Congress. It was established before we had offshore wind. It was established for all the other activities that are taking place in the ocean. Anything that happens from somebody doing research to oil and gas exploration to offshore wind have to apply for one of those permits. And essentially what you're telling the federal government is that there is a risk of exposure because of these activities. And the federal government looks at that risk, they look at the vulnerability of the particular species that the company is required to identify, and then they develop a mitigation plan. So what we haven't talked about here is that just because you get the authorization, which is really an insurance policy, what it's saying is, if you do happen to kill one of these, we can't take you to court and throw you in jail because you applied for this. It doesn't mean that there isn't a comprehensive mitigation plan. And I have examined every offshore industry in the ocean, and offshore wind by at least 3 times has more mitigation requirements than anything else we do in the ocean. Yes, it's absolutely true. There's no other vessel, there are not vessel speed restrictions on other vessels. Offshore wind vessels have to maintain 10 knot speed restrictions. They have to have protected species observers who are trained in identifying whales and marine mammals on board. They have to do a soft start when they begin pile driving. They have to shut down pile driving operation if they see a marine mammal within like a 500-mile radius of the offshore wind site. It's like 5 meters, sorry, like 5. But there's no other activity that we do in the ocean that requires this kind of vigilance. I went out to see the South Fork Wind Project, and there was a protected species observer aboard the ferry. With just taking people out to look at that offshore wind farm, because the offshore wind industry knows that if they're responsible for any collision or fatality related to marine mammals, that spells death for them. So they do above and beyond any other industry. And the question is, like, why don't we care that there are other industries in the ocean using this space, creating this noise, creating these risks that are not being regulated to that standard? Why is that not something that we're worried about?
It's not these kind of numbers, and there's no unusual mortality event in this area. That's why.
The unusual mortality event preceded, and Bob can speak to the unusual mortality event better than I can, but
Started before the surveys for the wind farm started. It did.
And it was maybe
Block ice.
solar well.
There are multiple kinds of sonar. Navy sonar is orders of magnitude louder than the high resolution geophysical sonar used for the wind farms. And this is where the misinformation, in fact, the difference between misinformation and disinformation is that disinformation is intentional. And it's repeatedly, there are repeated posts on social media calling the surveys that are done for the wind farm seismic, which is a complete lie. The seismic surveys are what's done for oil industry. Where were all you people when they want to drill for oil? Why are you people not out there demanding an end to lobster fishing? We know definitely that lobster fishing kills whales.
How much money has the University of Rhode Island and the Nature Conservancy and Duke taken from wind companies?
I have no idea. I got 6 million. So what?
All right, we're gonna take some questions from the audience. I'm looking through these. Several people have asked about, nuclear power as an alternative. Frank, you look at different energy sources. What are the practicalities of nuclear power as, an alternative solution?
I want some, wow, 6 million.
We'll talk. Yes, several questioners are asking about, nuclear power instead of wind power to get us out of our fossil fuel dilemma.
Yeah, that's could be part of the mix, but I mean, there's problems with that too, right? There's no problem.
Read the question, read the question.
Well, it's just general questions about nuclear power. I went through those. Look, I've got several questions here and they want to know about nuclear power. They say we want to find real solutions like nuclear power.
Okay, I guess problems with nuclear power too, right? I mean, what neighborhoods are they gonna go in? What's the ways? It takes fossil fuel emissions to make them too. I mean, it's not clean. If
I
you
have
really
one.
have,
I'll read your mind.
Never they work.
Are you aware that small modular thorium molten salt reactors are designed and being built around the world? These can't melt down. They can be plugged into brownfield coal or gas plants located anywhere while giving off no pollutants or waste that can be weaponized. Are you aware of that?
and yes, where's one operating? It's more,
In China. We gave that design, our Department of Energy gave that design to China in 2010. It was a globalist thing to try to get China not to build any more coal plants, but they're building a lot more.
By the way,
coal
they made
plants.
twice as much power as we do here, mostly from coal.
So this is only one of the 10 different designs that are out there now. These are not your legacy reactors. This is what Bill Gates is building. This is what Amazon is trying to get. This is what Kairos Power. Our DOE labs have several projects going right now in Idaho and in Oak Ridge to build these small modular reactors. They're coming. We just aren't going to get there before China.
Chris, a question. Did you want to say something else about that?
I'll have a follow-up.
Go ahead.
What's the cost of the power from one of those? Is it equivalent to natural gas and
Well, the
solar?
cost of power on a thorium reactor, because it doesn't burn uranium, is basically dirt, because you don't have to enrich it. Thorium is in the earth, so that's the one that I just talked about. But they will be cheaper than coal, because they're going to be built on assembly lines.
You have to
They're
mine
very
that.
slow.
Chris, have you, yeah, I know you have a different role,
I'm gonna get
but,
back to that question.
Oh, good.
If that is such a panacea, why am I not seeing it?
that's what I was gonna ask, Chris.
What's the answer?
The answer is regulation. We've had regulation for so long for our legacy reactors is to protect us from radiation, which hasn't really killed anybody except maybe 100 at Chernobyl. That's why.
What about
we
in
can't build
Japan?
anything. What's that?
What about in Japan? And that
That
tsunami.
killed zero.
That was a tsunami.
That was a tsunami that killed 20,000 people, 0 people. And the World Health Organization will tell you this has been affected by radiation from Fukushima. And about 100, statistically, you can't get more than even close to 1,000 out of Chernobyl. So the reactors that I'm telling you about are not the ones we have now. These are ones that
I
are.
understand what you're saying. I'm familiar with I've had a conversation with Ben about it, but if these restrictions are so, the only thing standing in the way, do you think our government's so effed up that they're not gonna change the restrictions and build this miracle energy?
Full of experts.
Okay, so I was in the Navy and I worked on a nuclear reactor all my life in the Navy. We are locked into a legacy reactor business here because the Navy reactors are what our legacy reactors on land are operated by nuclear power people. We're stuck in a very old legacy system here, and we haven't got the licensing regulations changed fast enough to get catch up.
Chris, what's your perspective as a state energy official about nuclear power and regulating? And I know there's federal jurisdictions as well, but what's your perspective on that?
Yes. So in terms of nuclear, I am not up to speed in terms of the federal requirements with nuclear in terms of, it's not something that historically has been proposed within Rhode Island, certainly in the last couple of decades. Nuclear is very interesting in terms of what we're hearing throughout the US, more recently in the Northeast, Mid-Atlantic, in terms of the microgrid nuclear opportunities linked to AI data centers. It's very interesting to follow. The reality, though, is with the AI data centers that we've been hearing a lot over the last several months, those AI data centers require significant amount of resources and land. I believe that an AI data center is anywhere from 2 to 250 acres minimum that a number of these companies are looking at across the country. And certainly we've seen some of the more recent announcements within the last probably month or two in terms of I think it's a drug like the nuclear facility in New Jersey being reactivated. I think there was some news in the last couple of days regarding Amazon with a nuclear opportunity. So it's certainly something interesting that we are following. Do I envision seeing any large scale nuclear facilities being proposed in Rhode Island? It's highly unlikely. Again, we are a very compact state. And based upon, so all I will say is, I was vividly following the gas plant proposal up in northern Rhode Island and the emotional reaction that triggered in several communities. And I know that several municipalities through their town and city councils passed resolutions opposing that project, including towns and cities that weren't even in geographically proximity to that proposed power plant. So based upon what we saw there, I would envision that we would likely see a very local reaction by towns and cities with that official idea. Again, there's nothing being planned, nothing in the pipeline. Again, the more things that we've been hearing about recently regarding the microgrid opportunities. And again, certainly, if and when such a proposal was brought forward, it'd have to go through a state process, it'd have to go through a federal process. But nuclear is certainly something that is interesting that we're kind of following from a distance right now.
Okay, here's a question from Barbara. Trish, I'm going to ask you to address this, and this is an argument I've heard from others as well, that we have statements on the record by Bohm, I assume through the permitting process, that approved all these wind farms that they will have little or no impact on carbon output and airborne pollution worldwide. So if that's the case, why are we doing it? And I mean, I guess I would ask you to respond to that. argument.
I don't know that, I don't really understand that argument, I guess.
Have you heard it? Are you familiar with
I
it?
think I've read it in things that were posted by like Green Oceans and people, but I looked directly at, so for every project, there's an you have to follow a National Environmental Policy Act that requires environmental assessment. That's triggered by every major federal action in the United States. So in the case of offshore wind, the major federal action that triggers that is leasing. And they perform an environmental assessment and they determine whether or not there's a significant environmental impact for that activity. And if there is, they do the follow-on environmental impact statement, which is usually triggered in the context of offshore wind with the construction operation plan for a particular project. As part of that environmental assessment, they consult with, it's somewhere between 12 and 15 other federal agencies and state agencies, and the EPA is responsible for doing basically providing like a profile for or validating the carbon emissions that are projected to be offset by the project and any other emissions associated with the construction of the project. So, where everything that we do relative to climate change is at a local scale first. Like we're all doing our part, right? That's why every state on the Atlantic coast has decarbonization strategies. We're all contributing to get to net zero by 2050, because net zero by 2050 is what is required to keep the global temperature limit below that 1.5 degree increase. Just as citizens of a global community, that's the contribution that we have to make. And so in order to figure out, well, how do I get to net zero by 2050 as the state of Rhode Island? Or how do I do that as the state of Massachusetts? They put together decarbonization strategies that say, this is the mix of energy, this is what's realistically available, this is what is commercially available. Small modular is something, to my understanding, that will probably be part of our energy mix, but it's not, according to the DOE reports I've read and NREL reports, it's not commercially and economically available at this moment in time.
It is
And
overseas.
So it's overseas, but not in the United States. So we can't just wait. Well, let me just.
You're sold on net zero by 2050. Does that include China and India?
No, but we can't be responsible. I can't be responsible for what you do in your house.
We're encouraging additional emissions in China and India by forcing something.
China's the world's offshore wind leader. They've deployed more offshore wind in China than anywhere else in the world, and so has Europe. So they too recognize, as we have to, that it isn't nuclear or go broke or offshore wind or go broke, that this is an energy mix that we need to make sure that people don't freeze to death in the winter when our energy demand goes up, and that the lights come on when we flip our switches. And we have to do all of those things. We have to reduce our personal demand. We have to do all of those things to mitigate climate. Unless we're in a place where we just don't believe that we can have any impact or climate change isn't real. And I'm not in a position to have that conversation.
Sure. Okay, thank you. Mike, I'd like to ask you, given your concerns about offshore wind, how do we get out of this climate dilemma without it?
Why doesn't Frank, you read the,
Yeah, we'll get to Frank in a minute, sir, but let's let Mike answer that question.
So our problem in Rhode Island, well, any solution, is space. Everybody's agreed that space is an issue for whatever the solution may be, right? So we have a siting problem.
Lack of space.
Lack of space. So where do you put anything, right? So in the context of offshore wind, the Coastal Zone Management Act, which these projects are weighed against, reads, citing major facilities related to energy, among other things, to the maximum extent practicable of new commercial industrial development in or adjacent to areas where such development already exists. This means the priority for development should occur where we already have stuff.
But what's our solution to get out of this power dilemma?
Not to destroy pristine habitat.
I understand that, but what's your solution?
My solution?
Yeah.
is maybe as Rhode Island, we have to say, we don't have much to offer. We need to be better, we need to lessen our consumption. We need cleaner facilities all around. We should consider nuclear. University of Rhode Island has a research reactor on campus. It's been there since the 60s.
Is it realistic though?
Nuclear is not unheard of in the state of Rhode Island.
For instance,
Just to start.
the URI reactor, yes.
I can say it needs to be used. I'm just saying there's precedent that nuclear. There's a nuclear fission reaction going on in the state of Rhode Island right now. So anyone that's afraid of a modernized fission reaction is like not even close to considering reality. We already have that going on in the state of Rhode Island.
Bob, you worked at URI, what's your view on this?
I think the argument boils down to nobody should do anything because each step by itself has no effect, so we should just sit back and do nothing.
That's not what we're saying.
It is.
No, it's not.
It is.
We're saying go nuclear, stop building a big experiment off our coast that has no known ultimate resolution. The Block Island experiment, it's only producing 30% of what it was projected to produce, and it's going down the rate.
That
What's gonna
leads,
happen with these new wind farms? What promises they make, what's actually gonna come?
that leads into a question, we've had a few questions about the intermittent, wind, that it's not, that it's intermittent power and therefore it's not as reliable. Do you want to address that?
Do I want to press that? No.
No.
What's that got to do with wetlands?
No, when he's talking about the Block Island wind farm, isn't it, so it made me think of that question.
I think the value sort of offshore wind, as I understand it, and there've been a couple of recent reports that maybe you've seen. If not, you can look at them. We also did a webinar on this, on the cost of wind. But Synapse and the Union of Concerned Scientists did reports on the cost of wind, and basically, one of the components of those reports looked at the winter reliability question. So what the National Renewable Energy Lab has said and the Department of Energy have said is that we have some of the strongest wind resources in the world off the Atlantic coast, and they happen to be strongest in the winter, when we know, particularly in places like New England, we will need that energy to keep our homes heated. And we know that there's a lack of predictability and unreliability with natural gas and the constraints that we've seen in the pipeline. We actually saw that, I think it was 3 or 4 years ago with Aquidneck Island, where some of those natural gas pipeline constraints left people without power, without heat for a little over a week in the winter. So one of the things that the independent system operator, ISO New England, is responsible for pulling together the energy mix. They're responsible for ensuring reliability. They're looking for a mix of energy resources that can help us address that winter reliability problem and winter peaking, which is a huge challenge in particular in New England. And so my understanding is that that's one of the reasons that offshore wind is considered to be such an important technology as part of the overall mix in terms of just the reliability question.
Chris, it's a question here saying that wind power will likely triple electric rates in the US. Do you agree with that? Or where do you see rates with offshore wind as it evolves here?
Yeah, so certainly with offshore wind, with the Revolution Wind Project, we executed that. We selected that project in 2018, and then it went through its regulatory review process for our Public Utilities Commission. That was approved in the spring of 2019. That was at a levelized price of 90.8 cents over the lifetime of the 20-year power purchase agreement. I can't discuss the South Coast Wind Project pricing right now, just because it's under the contract negotiations with the utility. Again, all that information will be filed with the Public Utilities Commission in early to mid-December. You know, I think when we look at energy, and the energy cost, try to look at it holistically, in terms of, it's not an apples to apples in terms of, what the price that you're gonna get out of the gas line, compared to developing a brand new project, whether that's offshore wind, solar, large scale hydropower, nuclear, all those potential opportunities. All of them have their price points, and it's just in terms of what do you look at in terms of the benefit cost, in terms of not only the energy, but economic development, both direct and indirect, positive and negative. We have our act on climate emission reduction standards in terms of when we are looking at our obligations in terms of emission reductions over the next couple of decades with the state's act on climate law. So there's a lot of variables that come into play. Certainly, we are always mindful. We try to strike that balance in terms of our energy portfolio, in terms of what we're acquiring for natural gas, in terms of winter and summer rates that we've been experiencing. The offshore wind attributes in terms of particularly during the winter months, when the resource is the strongest, when we're seeing the price spikes with natural gas. And then certainly regional procurement opportunities. Again, a component historically, when the renewable energy standard initially started, was we were getting pretty much most of our renewables through out-of-state resources. It was land-based wind up in Maine, it was biomass product materials in the northern New England, and then we kind of gradually integrated local renewables, predominantly solar, rooftop ground mount solar, some land-based wind when those opportunities have presented themselves. And then the rest of the portfolio mix is acquired in terms of, again, out-of-state resources in Maine, New Hampshire, Vermont. So that's the way that we look at it. Again, there's no one size fits all when it comes to energy pricing. We always try to strike a balance with a number of objectives to achieve those outcomes.
I don't think Mr. Kern answered the question. What is our price gonna be? What's the effect?
So in terms of the Revolution Wind project, 9.8 cents levelized over a 20-year period. That went through great scrutiny.
What's the aggregate price of electricity?
What is it now? The aggregate?
Yes.
In terms of,
When you add in wind and all the other diverse portfolio, what is the aggregate price of our electric bill?
so I guess I'm not following the question in terms of.
Well, I was asking, the questioner basically says that wind power will likely triple electricity rates in the US, not specifically Rhode Island, but we're in Rhode Island.
So I can't
So-
speak to nationwide in terms of whatever statistics you may have.
We're not asking about
But regional, but here in Rhode Island, if I can try to summarize what you're saying, is there's a process that plays out to feed this wind power into the system, but then how does it fit into the whole mix in determining what our electric bill is gonna be
This is way. All right.
later
If
versus
I pay
now?
50 a month now, what am I gonna pay?
Sorry, in terms of,
If my bill is $50 a day, and all this new stuff comes online, is my bill gonna be higher or lower?
so you're speaking about hypotheticals. in
Well, I think it
No.
depends on the mix.
So that it comes out of everyone's pocket as 17, 90, whereas it's still gonna be $50.
So it's gonna depend on the resource mix that we acquire.
It depends how much you're getting, right?
It's a lot of-
How much wind, how much is from gas?
And again, it depends on the resource mix that we acquire over a long period of time. Again, these things do not happen overnight. The Revolution Wind project is a several plus years project. The South Coast Wind project, again, I can't discuss that right now because it's under contract negotiations.
Certainly, everyone here is smart enough to know that if you're taking on this project, it's going to affect everyone's pocket one way or another, for better or worse.
So ultimately,
is our bill going
this,
to
so
go up
this,
or not?
so these projects go through a regulatory procedure for the Public Utility Commission
I
process.
care about
So,
9.8
again-
cents compared to what we're paying now. What's the difference? 9.8 cents. What are we paying right now to natural gas?
But again, the natural gas prices fluctuate year to year.
Well, I think you have to ask when the wind comes online, and then what the price of natural gas is then, how much is coming from each
It
source.
should be lower though, right? It should be lower. If we're doing this for the people of Rhode Island, their cost should be low.
So ultimately, the
But no, it should be better for us.
goal long term is to lower costs, but also stabilize prices in terms of what we're experiencing right now with our overly dependence on natural gas as we have these price swings in terms of the winter months for 6 months and then we go into the summer rate. So we're looking at renewable energy, but also energy efficiency. But again, it's not a simple answer in terms of, again, how we acquire our gas and the fluctuations in terms of how much we are heavily dependent on natural gas right now. So we have natural gas rates that fluctuate in terms
How
of,
much did natural gas fluctuate?
it fluctuates significantly. We've experienced some of the largest increases in the last couple of years.
20%?
20-30% fluctuations.
Compare that to offshore wind, how much percent?
Again, with offshore wind projects, the way that we look at these opportunities is we're gonna lock into a set fixed price and not an escalator type price. So for example, so the Block Island wind farm, when that PPA was executed and done, that was a set fixed price, but then escalators for 2 to 3% per year for a 20-year period. What we've done in terms of prospective projects that we look at is we want to avoid those fluctuations in pricing. So what we try to do is lock in a set fixed price. So you know what the price will be in year 1 through year 20, instead of what we're experiencing right now with natural gas, is we have that dramatic fluctuation. And depending on what is happening overseas, in terms of our global economy or global energy market, there's a ripple effect. And we're certainly seeing that play out over the last couple of years since the beginning of the Ukraine-Russian invasion.
What's the PPA per kilowatt hour? There you go, gas, PPA.
So the energy price, it's a spot market with natural gas.
We get that. You have a PPA. What's the PPA?
You don't have a PPA for natural gas.
No.
With renewable energy projects are generally financed over a 15 to a 30-year period. It just depends on the scale of the project. So we do like residential. There's a program where we do rooftop solar. They lock into a 15-year tariff for the price produced. With offshore wind projects, those contracts generally can be annual for 20 to 30 years. The Revolution Wind contract, that's for a 20-year term. So renewables energy, in terms of their brand new projects, their brand new infrastructure, they lock into a PPA in order to finance those projects. Whereas with the natural gas, that's the spot market. The utility acquires a certain amount of that commodity over a 6-12 month period. And then, for example, with Rhode Island Energy, they file their spring and their they file their winter rates in the fall, and then the PUC evaluates that, and then they file for their summer rates, and then that's evaluated. So it's not an apples to apples comparison.
PPA includes the capital cost.
All right, excuse me, I think we're gonna move on. I think we're going in circles here. You're not gonna get the answer you want. He's saying it doesn't exist. So he is giving the answer, it's not what you want.
No numbers.
Rich, I wanna turn to you. We have a question here about Cox's Ledge. And other people will probably want to respond to this on the panel as well. In 2012, did Senators Whitehouse and Reed and others in Rhode Island say that Cox's Ledge would be protected from wind farm development? Did NOAA and other environmental groups agree? And basically, you know, the CRMC, all these groups supposedly were against it, and then they were for it. So talk about that.
Sure. I mean, I can't speak to what the federal delegation stated because I just don't remember
But in
what
general.
they stated. But
Yeah.
but the Ocean SAM does clearly identify Cox's Ledge as an area where development of this nature should not occur.
And
So
tell us again, the Ocean SAMP is,
it's the Ocean Special Area Management Plan,
Mhm.
and it was developed by CRMC in 2010. It was the first in the country. It was an excellent plan. I worked on it in just the fisheries chapter. But it was recognized across the country as an excellent tool for planning development or planning uses
Mhm.
of the ocean environment.
Okay.
So CRMC was a leader then, and that plan said that Cox's Ledge, it identified many locations, but
Mhm.
Cox's Ledge was one of them, was an area of critical habitat, and that should not be used for what was, I believe is termed major projects. And this is.
So how was that addressed? How was that position addressed in the process that led to the permitting of the wind farms?
So what happened was BOEM came in,
Mhm.
Bureau of Ocean Energy
Federal
Management,
Bureau,
the
yeah.
Federal Bureau,
Mhm.
and they looked at wind resources. And they did not coordinate with the ocean salmon. They laid out the ocean in areas and they began selling leases. And they sold one large lease to Orsted.
Mhm.
And that large lease was then later subdivided into two smaller leases. And the two smaller leases are now Revolution Wind and South Fork Wind. And so what they did is Orsted paid a lot of money to BOEM to lease these areas. And
Right.
they said, okay, now we've got an area that South Fork Wind was only on Cox Ledge. And so they said, we're going to develop South Fork Wind first. But no, that was what they decided. I guess because of their agreements with New York State,
Mhm.
because South Fork Wind feeds
Goes to Long Island.
feeds power to Long Island. And as a fisheries advisory board, we said, look, that project is located on Cox Ledge. There are significant problems. We asked for many alternatives.
This was through the BOEM environmental review process.
This was actually through CRMC, but my organization submitted many questions to BOEM. And we asked for alternatives to be evaluated, which were not evaluated. But at any rate, what the developer said is, look, we've got no place but Cox's Ledge to build these turbines. And that's because they were allowed to subdivide the larger lease. What they should have had done is avoid Cox Ledge so that they did not build turbines on there.
I guess what I'm asking, did BOEM do an environmental assessment and did they do any mitigation or revision of the project to address any environmental concerns?
Absolutely, they did. They did an environmental impact statement. They did a draft environmental impact statement, which we commented on, and then they did a revised environmental impact statement. But they did not address the issue that Cox Ledge is critical habitat and that it should be avoided.
So they just ignored it flat out. They didn't say, we understand your argument, we just disagree, or they just didn't address it.
They didn't address it, right?
Trish, are you familiar with that process? When you've been involved in this process, can you?
I was involved alongside Rich for many years and helped write the enforceable policy section of the Ocean SAM with NOAA. So I just want to take a step back and give some background information, maybe find it helpful. BOEM administers the Outer Continental Shelf Lands Act. They're responsible for all of the leasing for all energy development on the Outer Continental Shelf. And that includes all ocean area that is from 3 miles from the shore out to the exclusive economic zone, which is about 200 miles. The Coastal Zone Management Act is also a federal act that gave coastal states jurisdiction out to 3 nautical miles from the coastline and up to 200 feet. I forget what it is in inland, but there's like a buffer there. I'm forgetting what it is. And as part of the Coastal Zone Management Act, states can develop what are called special area management plans. And they can go to the federal government, the agency NOAA, National Oceanic Atmospheric Administration, and ask for approval of the enforceable policies that they put in that document. Basically, they're saying, we think that there could be reasonably foreseeable effects from your federal activity in waters that we don't control on our state policies. And NOAA has to agree that these are enforceable policies and approve the document. And in the case of the ocean SAM, NOAA did that. And so part of the frustration that Rich is talking about is that there were specific provisions that were put into the ocean SAM that NOAA said could be viewed as enforceable policies, but then said could. And part of that is because NOAA had never really done this kind of work with the state before, and there was a lot of back and forth with legal about what could actually be an enforceable policy and what couldn't. And there was a lot of back and forth, and there were other provisions of the SAMP that were later modified as a result of that. When you have those enforceable policies in place, the state gets what's called a consistency review over any projects in federal water. And they get to vote, and they get to say, this project is consistent with our policies or is inconsistent with our policies. If they say it's inconsistent with the policies, they can still be vetoed by the Department of Commerce. Ultimately, the federal government is saying, we want to consider your interests and your concerns, but we have jurisdiction over this, and we will decide if this is in a national interest, we will decide. And so that's how that plays out, just from like a regulatory federal statutory standpoint. And it's
And that's exactly what happened in the case of the Fisheries Advisory Board, because we were recommending to CRMC that the projects not be approved, and we had good reason. We were following the CRMC's own regulations in the ocean SAMP. And then the CRMC said, but we are going to be overruled by the federal government if we don't allow it. And so it will be allowed anyway. And we said, we don't care. This is a state. And if we are a fisheries advisory board and we are trying to make you follow your own rules and regulations, then you should say that it's not consistent. You should not say that you should not pass the consistency review. Because that's in fact exactly what they did. And CRMC, in the case of South Fork Wind, we had been in negotiations with the developer as a fab and with CRMC being present for months and months, because they kept giving extensions to their deadlines because we couldn't come to an agreement. And then one weekend, CRMC management and the developer met privately behind closed doors, made an agreement, and that was the agreement. And the permit was issued, the consistency was approved, and we actually had our first resignation immediately after that. And a similar thing happened with South Fork, with Revolution Wind, and that's when the entire Fisheries Advisory Board resigned.
right. And I think it's important to understand the evolution of the agency as well. So that was, originally, just the minerals, I can't remember his names, MMS, but it was Minerals Management Service.
Federal.
Yeah, right, the federal agency, so it was doing like all oil and gas extraction and on land, and then it was morphed into this, it was BOEMR first, or BOEM, I forget what the acronym was, and then it became BOEM, right? And so it had to develop an approach, like an internal regulatory approach for how it was gonna do offshore wind. And I think we could say, I would say this, that the way we began off the coast here probably wasn't without its stumbles, and we were kind of inventing and creating the process. But that process has I have seen great and significant evolution of that process from the federal agency perspective. The way they do the siting analysis is much more iterative today than it was when we did it off the coast of Rhode Island and Massachusetts. They use NCOS.
And Trish, what we found is that some of the tools that they're now using would have rejected Cox's Ledge because it's an unacceptable location based on the current tools. And we still have to live with it. It was cited and it wouldn't be cited today because, like you say, the federal process has been improved. But That doesn't help us. We've got this junk out there chasing away all the fish.
Falling into the
I agree, we agree to disagree on that.
All right,
Well, me, my question instead of interpreting, is even mostly just representative of stuff. Everything that's in that section, I guess 3 less than 2012, instead of presenting like it's what.
well, I'm asking what they remember of it. I can't presume that they know. Yes, I understand. I think I was pretty clear that these public officials, he doesn't remember, and agencies said that they wanted to protect Cox's Ledge.
It's not a public hearing. Can't decide that.
2021, Sierra's staff report said that Cox's Ledge is the worst possible spot for development. And then Safe Betting came in and said, and we hardly wait.
Okay, and then Rich described what happened with those resignations after the CRMC reversed course. Thank you. Another question that I want to get to, a couple of people asked, is about the lifespan of these turbines and the cost to decommission them, and the question of whether a bond has been put up. And Chris, I guess I would ask you, as part of your negotiations for these projects, is that something that's discussed or considered?
So the decommissioning and the bond, related items are entirely handled by the Coastal Resource Management Council. I know we have one of my colleagues here today, so that's not an area of expertise for me, so I can on that topic as jurisdictional to the CRMC.
But it is something that is addressed.
Ultimately, that's the CRMC's process in terms of their permitting and evaluation of the project.
Okay. Well, and when they are bonded. Okay.
They are
Frank.
They are not bonded for decommissioning. Absolutely not, because we asked that at the Fisheries Advisory Board. We asked that be a requirement, and we were told by CRMC, no, it will not be a requirement, and there are no bonds for decommissioning.
Frank, do you want to weigh in on that?
I believe there was. I mean, I'm not saying, I could be wrong, but I thought there was. I mean,
Okay. Well,
settle down.
all right.
So if you had, we're the ones who pay for your mistakes.
My mistakes. I have reported, it's why I didn't know how to write into it.
Yes or no, whether our price is higher or lower. Simple question.
Well, we've been over that, sir. Chris, let me ask you this: whether it's bonded or not.
Of course, the prices are gonna be higher because opportunities sucking up energy, so of course they are, relative to what?
So, Chris, I know the bond is not in your area, but when price and negotiations take place in your office for these farms, is the decommissioning or lifespan of these farms factored in any way?
Yeah, so certainly those things are discussed, certainly will be brought up during the Public Utility Commission docket process in terms of the evaluation of the project that's brought before the Public Utilities Commission. There are advisory opinions that need to be issued, including from the Department of Environmental Management. And then again, separately, there will be the CRMC process if and when that project will be approved. Again, I'm not in the weeds on the CRMC process in terms of the FAB that have my colleagues at CRMC, you know.
Well, I meant from the part that you do play a role in, and maybe let's talk about Revolution Wind, because that's already been through that process.
So I can't, again, all matters related to the CRMC in terms of our role is the energy document.
Right, that's what I'm talking about.
PUC, but once the PUC process ends, then it embarks on the state and the federal
I
permanent
understand.
regulatory process.
I guess when and forgive me for not understanding this arcane process, but does the PUC process factor in the lifespan of the wind farm?
The PUC will certainly look at the lifespan of the project as they look at the lifespan of the power purchase agreement that's brought before them.
And what, do you know what the lifespan they looked at for Revolution Wind is?
So I believe the lifespan of the project proposal is over a 25 to 30 year period. The power purchase agreement though is for a 20 year term.
And then what happens?
So
In terms of power purchase, not the bond or whether there is a bond. But
So the power purchase agreement, depending on if and when it's approved and when it begins, would be locked in for a 20-year period. And then again, the shelf, the life of these turbines is likely beyond the 20-year period. And that power would be sold in the wholesale market after the power purchase agreement ends with Rhode Island Energy and then Offshore wind development.
Shouldn't these things be in place before we start building them? Shouldn't that be part of everything? Shouldn't the decommissioning be part of the project instead of just going, what's gonna happen later? Like, it's just simple, like, I don't understand why we don't have these things, they're not available to the public to know what's in escrow, what's going on, what bonds are available to protect us as the people of Rhode Island, which is your job.
So ultimately, our process is getting through the Public Utility Commission process. From there, it goes into the CRMC to all in terms of the environmental, the decommissioning, the bond. Those things are not jurisdictional to my office. Again, we have our function, our role, but then it goes into the respective other state or federal agencies to do their review process.
So is there anyone in this room that can say we have a decommissioning policy?
So any questions?
I think he's clear that it's not in his jurisdiction, and we can talk about whether that's a flaw in our system, but, Trish, do you have any perspective on that? No?
So Mike, one thing, as a fisheries advisory board, we looked at it and we said, this is public trust doctrine, so that this is public land and you are leasing it for an entity to construct something on the public land. Because of that, we expected that there would be decommissioning plan and that there would be a bond for decommissioning. Because otherwise you're not protecting the public's interest. And we were ignored and told that there was no such bond.
And, Rich, I want to go back to something you said near the beginning when the first small wind farm in Block Island was done. You said that process worked out more to your satisfaction. What was it about that process that worked so well that hasn't since, and what can be done to kind of recapture that harmony?
I think that project had a high level of outreach to stakeholders. We were told about the project as recreational fishermen. The commercial fishermen were told about the project. We made comments. We worked with CRMC, and actually I think it was CRC, Coastal Resource Center, down at URI. We worked with them as well, evaluating all the different aspects of what the effects might be, not only of the turbine locations, but of the cables. And there was a lot of interaction. And it was a completely state process. When these other turbines and these other locations were leased, now it became a federal process. And the feds basically didn't want to reach out and talk to stakeholders.
Has that changed? I mean, you've kind of walked away, from the CRC process, but Trish has talked about the growing pains that Bohm had and thinks it's better now, but you obviously don't. But what, I don't know, has it changed?
Well, I mean, I think the Bohm process has changed for projects that are very early on in the process, but we were already past those stages here in Southern New England. They had already laid out all of their leasing areas, and they had already sold off many of the leases. All of the leases that we're talking about here tonight were sold off before those improvements were made in the federal process. So, I don't know what it's like for the people down in New Jersey or out in California, if they're experiencing something better than we did, but I certainly hope they are experiencing something better, because that was the big problem. We had good interaction, and the other thing is, we looked at the specifics on the impacts, and the South Fork Wind Farm, the 5 turbines, they have what are called jacketed foundations. Now that means that they have 4 legs, and those 4 legs are pinned into the seafloor with with piling.
Black
Okay.
Talking about high.
Yeah, they're pinned into the,
You said self.
oh, I'm sorry, Block Island Wind Farm. Yeah, those 5 turbines at Block Island Wind Farm are pinned into the seafloor, and the foundation has these 4 legs, which have cross bracing going all the way up. So you have, number one, a very small impact during pile driving. I say very small. Relative to driving a 36-foot diameter pile 100 feet in the ground, it's a small impact. And you have more structure, which is more beneficial to marine growth and things like that. And so we looked at it and said, well, you know, you're supposed to learn from a project, and you're supposed to learn from the Block Island Wind Farm before you build the South Fork Wind Farm. And they didn't even do that because they came in and said, we're putting in these monopiles and we're not even going to consider jacketed foundations. And so these monopiles have decibel levels in the ocean, right in the report, of 217 decibels, which
You mean during the installation?
during the installation,
Driving.
right, during the pile driving, and even mitigated, it only comes down to 207 decibels. So it's like that. I know Bob would tell you that if a whale were to experience that, it would certainly damage the whale. But you know, the idea is to keep the whales away when you're generating that kind of power. But that kind of power is wasted into the ocean because of the design, the monopile design. We asked them to consider jacketed foundations, and they wouldn't.
Thank you. We've just got a few minutes left. Frank, I guess I'm gonna throw it back to you. You know, you wrote your column last week, kind of looking at the pros and cons, the difficult questions involved in offshore wind. What are your thoughts after hearing tonight's discussion?
I thought that would change. My point of that column was, honestly, I know we're talking about offshore wind, but the discussion we need to be having is consumption. We're talking about the United States and the global north, basically. We just consume beyond our needs. And if we don't address that, we're screwed. We're killing the planet. Not the you know, the inner core, the outer core, the mantle, but life on biodiversity ourselves. So offshore wind or no offshore wind, nuclear, whatever, we have to consume way less. If we're not willing to do that, it takes all of us. You just need to be, oh, I'm gonna do it, and a lot of people can do it. As a society, as humankind, we have to do it. And if we don't, then does it really matter? I mean,
But in the meantime, our ocean is being completely destroyed.
I agree, it's being destroyed now by, also by other things. You know, I'm not here to pick on fishing, but trawling or, you know, wells that you dig. The wells for oil are 2 miles deep.
Let's add more.
It's what?
Let's add more to it, the destruction.
No, that's what I'm saying. If we all reduce massively our consumption, if we wouldn't need offshore, and that's my point. My point is, if we keep going on this path, we're gonna get offshore wind, we're gonna get more fossil fuel plants, we're gonna get more massive solar field in California, for instance, familiar with it. It's in the Mojave Desert. It's like 250 square miles or something, and actually, it's not the typical solar farm. The panels are a little different, so birds fly through it, they actually get incinerated. So stuff like, I mean, if we're not going to change our behaviors, this is what we're gonna get. So I mean, I know this is a wind farm, and I know it's important. I'm glad people want answers and want to be, hey, what's the transparency of this? What are we paying for? The bonds, all that. That is massively important. We shouldn't just be sticking in the ocean. We shouldn't just be drilling here and doing that for anything, for any form of energy. You have to have all these answers, all these questions answered. And if we don't do that, we're gonna hang our heads against the wall.
Pause.
No, I'm suggesting a massive, right now, all of us, a massive reduction in what we consume. And I know I'm saying this, don't feel a switch. Okay, if you get everybody. Well, probably nothing would happen because I'm talking about we, not you or me or anybody else. We, as a species, still out of history, we're greedy. We're absolutely greedy. Consume everything in our sight as a species.
But how is building this over such a large area going
Not-
to reduce our consumption. There's
It's not, that's my point. If you don't reduce our consumption, we're gonna need more.
Why are we doing
All kinds of. Because we need the energy.
No.
Yes, we do.
Well, I think
Hey,
climate change is an
Climate change,
we do,
we have
right?
to stop burning, if the first thing we do, we have to stop burning fossil fuels. I mean, everybody knows that. It's what? Everything runs on.
Everything runs on fossil fuels.
ships that burn diesel and maintained by ships that burn diesel. There's
Right,
not.
and when fossil fuel power plants are built, their parts are delivered by trucks that burn diesel and equipment that burns diesel. I get your point.
Just don't call it green.
I don't care anything you should call it, green, it's just slightly less polluting.
It's not renewable.
Well, it's renewable in terms of wind, unless the wind stops, but it's. Not every day. No, I'm sick with this. You know, I feel
Right,
I don't know what I'm saying. Why are you up there, those?
Well, we're gonna wrap up. I think people can continue the conversation, and thank you for your attention, and thank you for your thoughtful questions, and thank you to our panelists.